In the high cold country above the Gallatin, in the autumn of 1887, a woman of 28 hauled a broken thing up a grade no sensible person would have chosen, and the men who watched her do it laughed until their sides ached. The wagon she dragged behind her one tired horse was a wreck, a freight wagon with a cracked rear axle and a bed half stove in, the kind of ruin a hauling company abandoned where it died rather than pay to move it. She had given $4 for it. The auctioneer had wished her joy of it and told the crowd she now owned the heaviest pile of kindling in Montana territory. What none of them knew, what she did not fully know herself yet, was that the wagon held something a powerful man had spent 11 years pretending did not exist, and that the proof of it sat under the driver's seat, behind a board nailed flush and painted to match. Her name was Della Voss, and she had come up out of the Madison Valley with a dead father's tools and very little else. She knew wagons the way some people know scripture, by the grain and the joint and the honest weight of a thing made to carry loads. Her father had been a wheelwright and a wagon builder, a man who could read a vehicle the way a doctor reads a body, and he had taught her every part of it before the lung fever took him in the spring. People in the new towns did not hire a woman to mend their axles. They sent her away with a kindness that was worse than cruelty, and so by that autumn she had $4, one horse named Tom, and a name nobody would trust with a wheel. You may already have known a person like her, someone the world decided about before it ever watched them work. Keep her in mind as this goes on. The frontier was full of such people, and now and then one of them got the chance to be proven right. The auction had been held at the edge of a freight yard outside the town of Coldspur, where the Northern Line had thrown down a siding and a water tower and a row of warehouses that smelled of axle grease and grain dust. A hauling concern had failed there the year before, and its scattered property was being sold off in lots by a thin auctioneer in a brown coat. Most of the lots were sound enough to draw real bids. Then they wheeled out the wreck. It came up dead last, towed into the yard behind a team and left to sit where it stopped. The bed sagged on a broken axle. One rear wheel canted inward at a sick angle. The canvas top was gone but for a few gray rags, and the seat board had warped and split until it looked like a thing chewed by weather. The auctioneer did not even climb up beside it. He stood off away, as a man stands off from a dead animal, and asked who would give him $1 to take it off the company's books. Della raised her hand. She had counted her money twice that morning and knew exactly what she could spend. When a man near the rope called out $3 to make sport of her, she said 4, plain and level, and the yard went quiet. And then it laughed. $4 for a wreck that could not roll. The auctioneer shrugged and brought down his stick and told her the heap was hers, and a man in a good wool coat near the front turned to the fellow beside him and said something that made them both grin. She did not hear the words. She did not need to. She had heard their kind all her life. What drew her to that particular ruin was not pity and not foolishness. It was the underframe. While the crowd saw a stove-in bed and a cracked axle, Della had walked the length of the wagon once, slowly with her father's eye, and she had seen that the running gear beneath the wreck was a grade of work that did not belong to a failed hauling outfit. The hounds were mortised, not bolted. The bolster was a single piece of seasoned oak. Someone had built the frame of that wagon to last 40 years, and then someone else had let the body rot off it. And that contradiction was a question. And Della Voss had never in her life been able to leave a question alone. She borrowed nothing and asked no favors. She hitched Tom to the front of the wreck with her own chain, set a skid of green poles under the dragging rear, and started the long pull-up toward the abandoned claim shack she had taken for the season, 3 miles up a wooded grade where nobody would charge her rent for a roof that leaked. The wagon fought her the whole way. It gouged the road. It slewed on the turns. It had to be levered straight at every switchback with a pole and her whole weight thrown against it. The broken axle dug a furrow in the dirt behind it like a plow no one wanted, and twice the skid poles snapped under the load, and she had to stop and cut fresh ones and work them under the dead weight on her knees in the road. Tom leaned into the collar and blew and shuddered, and she walked at his head as much as she pulled, talking to him low, sparing him on the steep ground, and taking the worst of the levering on herself. Men passing on the Cold Spur Road slowed their horses to watch. One of them, a freighter with a load of mine timbers, laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes, and called out that she should charge admission, that he would pay a nickel to watch a woman haul a coffin uphill. Another asked not unkindly whether she knew the thing would never roll again, and she said she did, and kept walking. She lifted her hand to the freighter, not in anger, just in acknowledgement, and bent back to the pole. She had decided long before that morning that she would not answer mockery with words, because words were what they wanted, and the work was what she had, and the work could not be argued with the way a woman's words always could. It took her the better part of a day to move that wreck 3 miles. By the time she got it level on the flat ground beside the shack, the sun was down behind the ridge, and her hands were 2 raw things she could barely close. She did not look at the wagon again that night. She watered Tom and rubbed the galls where the collar had worked him, ate cold bread standing up because sitting down meant not rising again, and slept like the dead with her boots still on. The wreck sat in the dark beside the shack, patient as wrecks are, holding what it held. What it held had been put there in the spring of 1876, 11 years before Della ever laid eyes on it, by a man who was now beyond caring, and a man who very much was not. To understand the thing under the seat, you have to go back to the Helena Road and a freight outfit called the Marsh and Eddy Company, which in the middle 1870s carried ore and bullion and payroll between the mines of the upper district and the assay offices and banks below. Freighting bullion was a trade built on paper as much as on mules. Every load that left a mine was weighed and recorded, and a copy of that record traveled with the wagon, signed by the shipper, and meant to be signed again by the receiver, so that what left the mountain and what arrived at the bank could be set against each other and made to agree. When they did not agree, someone had to answer for the difference. In the spring of 1876, a great deal of bullion left the Garnet Hill mine, and a markedly smaller amount arrived at the Cataract Bank in Helena, and the difference was a fortune. The shortfall was blamed on a road agent's robbery that the company swore had taken place at the river crossing, and on a teamster named Amos Kerr who had driven that load and who conveniently could not be found to give his account. The bank took the loss. The mine took the loss. The insurance underwriters paid out on the robbery, and the man who owned the controlling share of Marsh and Eddy collected on the policy and walked away richer than the missing bullion would have made him. His name was Harlan Pugh, and by 1887 he was a respectable man in Helena with a stone house and a seat on 2 boards, and he had spent 11 years certain that the only record that could undo him had burned with the wagon he had ordered burned. He had been wrong about the wagon. The teamster Amos Kerr had not been a robber and had not run. Amos Kerr had been an honest and frightened man who had seen the weights at the mine and seen the receipt the company prepared and understood that the numbers had been made to lie, and who had done the one thing an honest teamster could do. He had kept his own copy. He had kept the original weighmaster's tally, the true one, signed by the mine's own weigher before any clerk of Puah's had touched it, and rather than carry it where it could be taken from him, he had hidden it in the wagon itself. Behind a board he fitted under the driver's seat. In a slot he chiseled into the seat riser with a wheelwright's care. Then the company had turned on him, and the robbery story had been built around his name, and Amos Kerr had left the territory in the night with nothing but his life, and the wagon, no longer needed, had been sold down and down through a dozen hands until it cracked an axle outside Coldspur, and a hauling concern abandoned it as not worth the freight to move. None of this did Della know on the morning she first set her father's tools on the warped seat of her $4 wreck and began, simply, to take it apart. She began because that was what you did with a wagon you meant to save. You stripped it to the frame. You learned what was sound and what was rotten. You saved every piece of iron and every seasoned board, and you threw nothing away until you understood it. She started at the front with the seat, because the seat was the worst of it, and because her father had always said, you begin with the part that lies to you most. The seat of a wagon takes the weather and the weight of years and tells you, by how it has failed, the whole history of the vehicle. This seat lied. She saw it within the hour. The seatboard itself was warped and split, as she had thought. But the riser beneath it, the upright frame that carried the seat above the box, was newer wood than the rest of the wagon, and had been fitted by a different hand. The joinery was good, careful even, but it was not her father's grade of work, and it was not the work of whoever had built the splendid running gear below. It was the work of a third man, a competent man working quickly. And he had done something to the seat riser that no wagon builder would ever do without a reason. He had built it hollow. She found the seam first with her fingers, then with the thin blade her father had used for tracing joints. A board had been let into the front face of the riser and nailed flush and painted over with the same dull paint as the rest, so that to the eye it was simply part of the frame. Only the grain gave it away, the grain of the letten board running crosswise to the grain around it, a small wrong note that the eye slid past but the fingertip caught. She sat back on her heels in the cold morning and looked at that seam for a long moment, the way her father had taught her to look at a thing before laying a tool to it. Then she set the blade in the seam and began to work it loose. Here is the thing about patient work, the thing the men in the yard would never have understood. It is not slow because the worker is weak. It is slow because the worker refuses to break the thing she is trying to free. Della could have split that board out in 2 minutes with a pry bar and a blow, and she would have destroyed whatever lay behind it. Instead, she spent 2 hours easing the nails, drawing each one straight back along the line it had been driven, working the blade and then a thin wedge, and then her fingers until the lead-in board came away whole in her hands, and she was looking into a dark slot chiseled into the heart of the riser. Something was inside it. Wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark with age, pushed deep into the slot and held there by a wooden peg, was a flat packet about the size of a folded newspaper. The cold air that had been sealed inside that slot for 11 years touched her face as she drew the packet out. It smelled of linseed and old wood, and the particular dry mustiness of a thing that has waited a long time in the dark. She did not open it in the cold. She carried it inside, built up her small fire, washed and dried her hands, and only then unwound the oilcloth on the plank table by the window where the light was good. Inside the oilcloth was waxed paper, and inside the waxed paper were folded documents, 3 of them dry and whole and perfectly legible, the ink only a little browned. She read them slowly. She read them twice, and the cold that went through her then had nothing to do with the autumn morning. The first was a weighmaster's tally from the Garnet Hill mine, dated the 9th of April, 1876, recording the weight of a bullion shipment in the weigher's own hand, signed and stamped with the mine's die. The second was a shipping receipt from the Marsh and Eddy Company for the same shipment on the same date, recording a weight a great deal smaller. The third was a single page in a cramped, careful hand, signed Amos Kerr, that explained in plain words what the other 2 pages proved: the honest weight that left the mine, the false weight the company wrote down, the robbery that was invented to cover the difference, and the name of the man who had ordered the false receipt written and had stood to gain by it. set down in a frightened teamster's hand 11 years before. Della Voss sat at the table a long time with the 3 pages in front of her and understood slowly what she had bought for $4. She understood something else, too, and this is the part that says most about her. A lesser person, or only a more frightened one, might have burned the pages or buried them or sold them quietly back to the man they named. The pages were worth a fortune to the right buyer, and worth a woman's life if the wrong people learned she had them. She sat with that knowledge for a long while in the cold cabin, turning it the way she turned a doubtful joint in the light, looking for where the weakness lay. She was a woman alone in a leaking shack with $4 spent and a winter coming, and she had in her hands a thing that powerful men had killed reputations to keep buried. No one would have blamed her for letting it lie. No one would even have known. Della had been raised, though, by a man who believed that a wagon's whole virtue was that it carried honest weight, that the entire moral of the trade was, you wrote down what was truly there, and you did not shave the figure to please the man paying you. She had watched her father turn away, paying work rather than stamp a wheel he knew was unsound, and she had watched what that cost them, and she had never once heard him say he regretted it. To hold the proof of a great lie and do nothing was, to her, a kind of false weight of her own, a figure shaved to keep herself safe and comfortable. She found she could not write it down. She folded the pages back into the waxed paper and the oilcloth over that, and she set the packet on the high shelf above the fire, and she began, carefully and without quite knowing yet where it would lead, to find out who Amos Kerr had been and whether anyone living still bore the cost of what had been done to him. That search is how she met the old man. His name was Eli Bracht, and he lived 4 miles down the valley in a cabin chinked with river mud, a weathered man past 70 who had freighted on the Helena Road in the 70s and had stopped because his hands would no longer hold the lines. Della went to him because in Coldspur, when she asked carefully after the old freighting days, 3 different people had said the same thing. If you want to know about the road in those years, ask Eli Bracht, for he remembers every wagon that ever broke an axle and every man who ever drove one. She did not show him the pages at first. She asked him about wagons, which was true enough, and let him talk. And an old freighter given a listener will talk a long while. He told her about the grades and the river crossings, and the mules he had loved and the mules he had not. And when she asked, as if idly, whether he had ever known a teamster named Amos Kerr, the old man went quiet and looked at her differently. Amos Kerr, he said, was the most honest man on that road, and the company hung a robbery on him to cover a theft and ran him out of the territory, and nobody ever proved different because the proof was supposed to have burned. He said it flat and bitter, the way a man says a thing he has carried unspoken for a long time. Then he asked her, his voice careful, why a young woman buying a wrecked wagon would be asking after a teamster 11 years gone. So she told him, and she showed him the pages. Eli Bracht held the Waymaster's tally in his shaking hands, and read it, and read the receipt, and read the page in Kerr's own writing, and when he set them down, his eyes were wet, and his voice had gone rough. He had driven the wagon behind Kerr's on the last leg of that very road, he told her. He had seen Amos Kerr's face when the company men came for him. He had believed in his heart for 11 years that Kerr was innocent, and had been able to do nothing about it. And here was a woman he had met that morning, laying the proof of it on his table, drawn out of a wagon he himself had watched abandoned outside Coldspur as worthless. That afternoon, the 2 of them, the old freighter and the young wheelwright, became something the powerful man in Helena had never reckoned on. Not a confrontation, not a posse, something quieter and far more dangerous to him. They became 2 people who knew exactly what had happened and could prove it, and who meant to set it right in the one way that could not be argued with. Eli Brack knew what had become of Amos Kerr. The teamster had gone south into Wyoming after the company turned on him, drifting from one outfit to another under the shadow of a name no honest concern wanted on its books. And he had died there 4 years back, a poor man to the end, never cleared, his name still attached in the territory's memory to a robbery he had not committed. Eli told it slowly, the way a man tells a thing he has grieved over. Kerr had written to him once, years after, a short letter from a railroad camp, asking only whether anyone back on the Helena Road still believed him. Eli had not known how to answer it, because the honest answer was that the road remembered him as a thief. And so, he had not answered at all. And that silence had sat on the old man ever since like a debt unpaid. Kerr had left a daughter, Eli said. Her name was Susanna, and she had been a girl of perhaps 10 when her father was ruined, old enough to understand that the men in town spoke a certain way about her family, and young enough not to understand why. She had married a section hand and lived now near Livingston, down along the rail line, and she had grown up and grown old before her time, as the child of a man everyone called a thief. That, Eli said, his rough voice dropping, was the cost that was still being paid. Not the bank's lost bullion, which the bank had long since written off, and the underwriters had covered and no living person now missed. The cost was a woman down in Livingston who had buried her father under a lie and gone on living beneath it, and who did not know, could not know, that the proof of his honesty had been waiting all these years inside a wagon her own father had built it into. Della did not go to Helena. She did not write to the newspapers or seek out the law to make a noise. She had learned from her father that you do not announce a repair before you have made it. Instead, she did the patient thing, the thing that took weeks and could not be hurried, the thing that the men in the freight yard would have had no patience for and no understanding of. She had the 3 documents copied, faithfully and under witness by a clerk in Coldspur, whose honesty Eli vouched for, so that the originals need never leave her keeping and could not be made to disappear. She gathered, with Eli's help, the names of 2 other men still living who had freighted that road in 1876 and remembered the robbery story and could swear to the dates and the route. She learned the name of the assay office that had received the short shipment and confirmed through its own surviving records that any citizen could ask to see the weight the company had reported. She built, slowly and without a single raised voice, a structure of fact around the 3 pages from the wagon, so that when the truth was finally set before the right authority, it would stand not as one woman's claim, but as a wall of evidence that no respectable man's word could push over. It was during those weeks that Della came nearest to giving the thing up, and it is worth telling why, because it was not fear of Harlan Pugh. It was the wagon. Word had gotten back to Coldspur, as word does, that the woman who bought the wreck was asking strange questions about old freighting matters, and a man came up the wooded grade one afternoon in a good wool coat, a man she recognized as the one who had grinned at the front of the auction crowd. He was pleasant. He admired the running gear. He said he represented certain interests who collected old vehicles of historical character, and he offered her $200 for the wreck, just as it stood, body and frame and seat and all. $200 was more money than Della Voss had held in her life. It was a winter of warmth and a spring of seed, and an end to being laughed at on the Coldspur Road. And she understood, the moment he named the sum, exactly what it meant. A man does not offer $200 for a $4 wreck unless the wreck is worth a great deal more to him gone than kept. The offer was not a windfall. It was a confession. Somewhere, somehow, Harlan Pugh had learned or guessed what his old wagon might still carry, and he was trying to buy back the seat before the board came loose. She told the man in the wool coat that she had grown fond of the wagon and meant to rebuild it. He smiled and raised the offer to 300. She thanked him and said no. His smile thinned, and for just a moment something flat and cold looked out of his pleasant face, and then he tipped his hat and went back down the grade. And Della stood beside the wreck with her heart going hard, and knew that she had just refused enough money to change her life, and knew she had been right to. That night she moved the 3 original documents from the cabin to a place only she and Eli knew, and she slept badly. And in the morning she got up and went on with the work, because going on with the work was the only answer she had ever had to anything. The work, in the end, was a wagon. She rebuilt it that autumn and into the first hard weather, not to sell and not to prove a point, but because it was a good frame that deserved a body, and because her hands needed the labor while the slower business of the truth went forward. She drew the cracked rear axle and forged a new one true, heating and hammering the iron in a stone forge Eli helped her raise beside the shack, the old man working the bellows while she struck, the two of them falling into the rhythm of people who have each spent a life around tools. She replaced the stove-in boards of the bed with seasoned planks she split, and dressed herself, mortised and pegged the way the original builder had done, matching her work to his out of respect for a craftsman she would never meet. More than once she stopped and ran her hand along the original running gear and the new wood beside it, and could not have told a stranger where the old work ended and hers began, and that to her was the whole of the trade. She trued the canted wheel, drawing the loose tire, resetting the spokes one at a time, shrinking the iron back hot so it gripped the wood like it meant it, the steam hissing up white in the cold air when she quenched it. And she rebuilt the seat riser, the hollow one. But she left the slot in it, empty now, and she fitted the lead-in board back over it, because some things you keep as they were, so you do not forget what they held. People on the Cold Spur Road stopped laughing somewhere in those weeks, though no one announced it. They saw the wreck become a wagon. They saw the woman who had dragged a ruin up the grade bring it back down again on its own. 4 wheels, true and sound, and handsomer than half the rigs in the county. And a thing happens to mockery when the thing mocked turns out to have been right all along. It doesn't become applause. On the frontier, it became a kind of careful silence, men touching their hats to her now, where they had laughed before, not because they had grown gracious, but because they had been shown, plainly and without a word of argument, that they had been wrong about what they were looking at. When the structure of evidence was complete, Della did the last patient thing. She did not take it to Harlan Pugh. She took it, with Eli Brack beside her and the copies in hand, and the originals safe, to the federal district where such frauds were answered, to a commissioner whose office had jurisdiction over the old insurance claim, because a fraud against the underwriters in 1876 was a matter that did not grow stale the way men hoped it would. She laid the weighmaster's tally beside the company's receipt. She laid Amos Kerr's page beside both. She laid the assay office's surviving record beside the company's reported weight, and the 2 old freighters' sworn accounts beside the date and the route. And she let the documents do what documents do when they are true, and when there are enough of them. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She set down honest weight beside false weight, exactly as her father had taught her a wagon's papers were meant to do, and she let the difference speak. What happened to Harlan Pugh happened the way such things happen to such men, which is to say, quietly and at a distance, and without any satisfying scene. He was not dragged from his stone house. There was no confrontation on a Helena street. There was, instead, an examination of an old claim that everyone had thought closed, and a set of records that did not agree, and a careful unwinding of 11 years of respectability that came apart the way a badly built joint comes apart once the true load is finally set on it, his name, which had been a thing of weight in 2 boardrooms, became a thing men did not want said near their own. The fortune he had built on the burned wagon was found to rest on a wagon that had not burned, and the law took its slow grip. And somewhere in an office Della never entered, a man who had been certain for 11 years that the only record against him was ash learned that a woman had bought it for $4 and pulled it up a hill. She never saw his face when he understood. She did not need to. The seat had come loose, and that was enough. The part of it that mattered to Della was never Pooh. It was Livingston, and a woman named Susanna who had grown up the daughter of a thief. Della went to her in the early spring when the roads opened, driving the rebuilt wagon down out of the high country with Eli beside her on the seat. She found a careworn woman near her own age, hanging wash in the wind behind a section house. A woman who looked at the wagon and the strangers on it with the wary patience of someone life has taught to expect little. Della got down and introduced herself, and said she had come about Amos Kerr, and watched the woman's face close like a door, because the name Amos Kerr had brought nothing but shame to that house for as long as Susanna had been alive. Then Della told her, not all at once and not as a speech, but plainly, standing in the cold spring wind with the wash snapping on the line, and Eli waiting quiet on the wagon seat behind her, that her father had been an honest man, that he had seen a theft and had not been able to stop it but had refused to let it stand, and had hidden the proof of his own innocence in the one place he trusted, the wagon itself, behind a board under the driver's seat where he had fitted it with his own hands, that he had paid for that honesty with his name and his home and the rest of his life on the road, that the proof had waited 11 years in the dark under that seat while the wagon was sold down, and at last abandoned as worthless, that it had been found, that it had been read and copied and witnessed and laid before the law, that the record now said where any official could read it, that Amos Kerr was no thief but the one honest man in the whole affair. Susanna Kerr did not weep at first. She stood very still, one wooden clothespin still in her hand, the way her father must have stood when the company men came for him on the road. She made Della tell parts of it twice, not because she doubted, but because the words were too large to take in at one hearing, and each time she heard a piece of it again, something in her face shifted and settled. Her husband came out from the section house and stood in the doorway and went still as well, listening. And then Susanna put out her hand and touched the side of the rebuilt wagon, the plain pine of the new bed, and asked in a low voice if this was the wagon, the very one. Della said it was, and the woman walked the length of it slowly, the way Della herself had walked it that first day in the auction yard, and came to the seat and laid her open hand flat against the riser her father had hidden the truth inside, and stood like that a long while. What passed over her face then wasn't joy exactly, because the dead do not come back for a cleared name, and Susanna had no father to run to with the news. It was something graver and better than joy. It was the lifting of a weight she had carried so long. She had stopped feeling it as a separate thing, the shame that had been laid on a 10-year-old girl, and had grown with her and gone with her into her marriage and her middle age, until she no longer knew where it ended, and she began. Her shoulders came down from where they had been set for 30 years. She breathed out, long and shaking. When she finally wept, it was quietly, with her hand still on the wood, and she did not turn away to hide it, because for the first time in her life there was nothing in the name of her father that she needed to hide from. Have you ever carried a thing so long you forgot it was not simply part of you? That was the weight that came off Susanna Kerr in the spring wind, and the woman who lifted it had been laughed up a hill to do it. Della did not take payment from Susanna, who had none to give. and she did not take the reward the underwriters offered when the old claim was reopened. Beyond what covered the cost of the copies and the witnesses and the iron she had bought to rebuild the axle, to take more, she felt, would have been to put a thumb on the scale of a thing that was supposed to be about honest weight. She kept the wagon. She kept her father's tools. She let the rest go on to the people the lie had cost, and there were several, and the slow work of restitution moved through that country for a year after. Debts of reputation settled one careful page at a time. Amos Kerr's name was set right in the territory's records that summer. It was a small notice, the kind most people never read, a correction of an old account. But Susanna read it, and Eli read it, and Della read it, and the three of them knew what it had cost to put it there, and what it was worth. Eli Bracht lived 2 more years and drove the rebuilt wagon often in that time, slow and proud on the valley roads, an old freighter who had lived to see the one wrong that haunted him made right. When he died, he left Della the river mud cabin and his old set of freighting irons, and she took them the way you take anything from a man you have come to love, which is gratefully and with the intention of using them. Della Voss stayed in that high country. She got, in the end, the work she had been refused. A woman who has rebuilt a freight wagon true enough to outlast its makers, in plain sight of a whole valley, does not have to argue her trade any longer. And the same men who had laughed on the Cold Spur Road brought her their broken axles and their sprung wheels, and paid her honest money to set them right. She never spoke of the documents to them, and she never gloated, and when now and again some newcomer asked why the rebuilt freight wagon had an empty slot chiseled into the seat riser, fitted with a board that came away clean, she would say only that it was where the wagon had kept something important once, and leave it at that. The wagon outlived her father's tools and very nearly outlived Della herself. In her old age, it stood under a shed roof she built for it, retired from work, its irons still true and its joints still tight. And on spring mornings she would sometimes go and sit on the seat she had rebuilt and lay her hand on the leaden board over the empty slot. She did not need to take it loose. She knew what it had held. She knew what it had cost the man who hid it there, and what it had given back to his daughter. And she knew that a thing the whole world had called worthless and dragged off to die had carried, all that while, the one true weight that set 3 lives back upright. $4, the men had said, for the heaviest pile of kindling in Montana. They had not known how to read a wagon. Della Voss had, because a dying man had taught her, and because she had never in her life been able to leave a question alone, and because she understood the one thing the powerful man in his stone house had forgotten. A thing built honest by honest hands to carry honest weight will keep the truth long after the men who feared it are gone. The seat came loose. The truth came out. And the wagon, mended and quiet under its shed roof, kept her company to the end.